Hello, welcome. My name is Vikram Chandra, and you're watching This World. This is the program where we essentially take a look at all the big global developments that are taking place across the world, and we analyze them from an Indian perspective. And I can tell you that this week, the biggest story in the world was playing out right here in India. And I'm talking, of course, about the G20. It has been a fairly dramatic day so far. Right now, everyone's gone off to have dinner, but it's been a dramatic day so far. At least three major and dramatic developments that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, and we're going to be discussing them with experts over the next half an hour or so. We've got big experts joining us. Sergei Markov is joining us, former spokesman for President Putin, joining us live from Moscow. Zemetene Negatu is joining us, the global chairman, Fairfax Africa Fund, who's going to be joining us from Addis Ababa. Senior journalist Terrell Yu Jones is joining us from California. We're going to have experts joining us from Dubai, and Jessica Stone of the VOA is going to be joining us right from here in the studio. But before I go to any of that, what were those major developments that I was speaking to you about? Number one, contrary to what many had feared, we do have a Delhi declaration. There was a consensus. Yes, it required some compromises, I guess, but there was a Delhi declaration, and that's a major achievement. Number two, the African Union now has a seat at the high table. It's been inducted into the G20. And number three, a dramatic new plan has been unveiled to connect India to the Middle East and to Europe. So all of that has actually played itself out. Now, I'm going to be looking at each of them in turn to some extent. Well, let's start analyzing all of this. I do have Jessica joining me right now from the Voice of America. Jessica, help us understand this, the events of today and the fact that we actually do have a Delhi declaration. Now, yes, there were compromises that were made. It's being hailed as a major victory, the fact that there is a declaration at all. How is this being seen in the rest of the world? What are the sort of headlines that you're reading?
Well, I think it's first of all important to realize how early this came. I mean, this was not the 11th hour Bali declaration that I certainly was anticipating, given what we went into with the divisions over climate and, of course, the well-known and established divisions over the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I personally did not think we would be talking about a communique by dinner time, much less by, sort of happy hour, if you will. So that's a tremendous achievement. It was, however, achieved by concessions. And I think a lot of the headlines we're seeing out of the West in particular indicate that the coverage is pretty critical of the path that this communique took to get here, which is to say that the West caved to the interest that wanted to be a little bit softer when it comes to Russia's role in the Ukraine war, particularly on the question of the war against Ukraine or the war in Ukraine. That had been a hang-up that was addressed in Bali. They kept a war against Ukraine. This time we only see war in Ukraine, which has a little bit more gray area for who's responsible for the war.
Jessica, if I could just look at those compromises that you're talking about. You're saying that many in the West and many of the critical headlines are about the fact that Russia has not actually been named as an aggressor, not in this, unlike Bali. And that obviously was something that Russia and China had said very clearly. They're not going to accept a Bali-like formulation. So that was more or less off the table. I guess the other side would say it's at least been mentioned that, this is not a time for war. Language like that is there. No nuclear threats. That language is there. But yes, you're right. Russia has not been named as an aggressor in this, unlike Bali.
Correct. And the White House, in conversations with reporters this afternoon, was clear that this is a good thing, that getting a consensus in this communique, particularly this early, is definitely a good sign, and that they were pleased, in particular, with the language around not supporting forceful takeovers of sovereign territory, which, of course, could also be applied to China in the Taiwan question.
You're right. That language about aggression is something that could be relevant in other struggles and other battles as well. Jessica, thank you so much for bringing us that sort of a reaction to what is coming in. And yes, Delhi Declaration has been passed, but yes, there were compromises in it. Let's now get a sense of this directly from Russia. Actually, we haven't heard much from Russia at all in the build-up to G20, what is being expected. Vladimir Putin himself, of course, remember, is not here in Delhi. But we do have with us right now on the program live Dr. Sergei Markov, who is a former spokesman for President Vladimir Putin. Thank you so much, Dr. Markov, for joining us. I wanted to get your reaction to the Delhi Declaration and to the language that there is in it, specifically when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Russia has not been named as the aggressor this time, unlike in Bali. The language on that is not there. But it's a clear indication that this is not a time for war and there shouldn't be wars to try and get territory from other countries. That language is very much there.
First of all, we're glad the declaration adopted, and it's a big success of the Prime Minister of India and India as whole as a new rising superpower. Secondly, we can see that now G20 divided between a collective West and global South. And the discussion was among them on the few directions. There are two teams worked there. And thirdly, we're glad that Global South is becoming more stronger. And this also BRICS a team, we can call it. And the BRICS team now more dominating in this language. And we're very glad that this idea of the Global South and BRICS countries have been adopted, that it's not war against Ukraine, it's war on the Ukrainian territory between Russia, in fact, and United States. And Russian army come to the Ukraine not to fight against Ukraine, because Ukraine does not exist from our point of view, because it's occupied by the United States of America. And we're glad that this
Dr. Markov,
idea...
Dr. Markov, I don't want to really, we've been hearing the debates and discussions around Ukraine at great length, so we don't necessarily want to go into all that. Just to understand from your point of view going forward, a lot of developmental things have been put into the Delhi Declaration, which is very much there. On the call of let's try and find peace, this is not a time for war, let's try and move on that in Ukraine. Do you think that message is there in Russia? Is that part of what is being taken on board?
Yes, Russian expected that we should not only talk about Ukraine, it's Russia wants the peace very much, because our people died, and Russian people who is Ukrainian citizens also died, because 70% of the Ukrainian citizens are Russians. So we want this war to stop as soon as possible. But with discussion about this now with collective Western absolutely senseless. But what has sense, a lot of sense, is to think about new infrastructure of the global economy. And that collective Western countries should not continue their too selfish and too imperialist policy. We think even such language from our position, from position of the BRIC countries, could be more strong. We can see that a global majority, I would say, who want to have more justice in the world economy. And we have a small group of the collective Western countries, G7 countries, who want to continue the neo-imperialist, neo-colony style of building this global economic infrastructure.
All right, Dr. Markov, I think we hear you loud and clear. I think there's a lot that has to be discussed here. We'll try and do a more detailed question and answer session with you, and perhaps a more detailed interview a little later to fully try and understand the path forward, especially when it comes to Ukraine. But I'm trying to cover all the other major events also that took place today. It wasn't just the Delhi Declaration and discussions around Ukraine or Russia. Delhi Declaration was one of the day's biggest headlines, but here's another one. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. The project will link India with West Asia and with Europe. It was announced during day one, of course, of the G20 summit, and it's being called an alternate to the BRI, which is, of course, China's Brick and Road Initiative. Now, this is essentially going to be a rail and shipping corridor, part of an initiative called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. It is expected to boost trade, transport, energy, resources, and also improve digital connectivity. Let's just listen in to what the American President Joe Biden said while actually announcing this project this evening.
And today I'm proud to announce that we've finalized the historic agreement for a new India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. As a key part of this corridor, we're going to invest in ships and rail that extends from India all the way to Europe, connected by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel.
And the President of the European Union was also there, Ursula von der Leyen, highlighted how this project will be the most direct connection to date between India, West Asia and Europe. So there's a very strong European connection, of course, in all of this. She also added that the economic corridor will make trade between India and Europe 40% faster. Let's also listen in to what the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had to say. He was also there as part of the entire announcement. And to talk more about this, joining me live from Dubai, Ehtisham Shahid, who's the editor at the Emirates Policy Center. Ehtisham, thanks a lot for joining us. This, of course, potentially a game-changing development. What is it that you can really piece together on this? Ships seem to be, it seems that the ships will run from India to perhaps the UAE to Dubai. From there, then there are going to be these train connections and then onward connections onto Europe. What can you tell us from whatever you've been able to pick up?
So it's a combination of a lot of piecemeal approach that the region is on both sides have been trying to put together, and it's with a far bigger momentum because you can see when a force like G20 puts its weight behind a project such as this, it is definitely going to get to another level. So we've been hearing a lot about the ship connection between the UAE and India that you just talked about, and UAE in itself, Dubai in particular, has had a logistics project which kind of brings the air and the land and the sea and the train network together. So if all of that is put together, this could be the momentum that we've been talking about for a long time, and it could go to another level if this really takes shape.
Right. Just to sort of, again, look at the other bigger strategic initiatives that this could possibly dovetail into. We've been hearing a lot of talk about I2U2, which is, India, Israel, the UAE, and America. There's been talk about perhaps Saudi Arabia also opening up ties with Israel. Do you see potentially this Middle Eastern connectivity bid tying up with that very closely?
Oh yes, it definitely will. And I2U2 in itself was a byproduct of the Abraham Accords that happened before that. So it's coming together of a lot of interests. As I said earlier in the morning, this strategic autonomy is also leading to a churning of a kind that has not been witnessed before. So apparently forces that were not looking eye to eye on a lot of issues are suddenly realizing that they're much better off working together, especially on projects such as these, which have far more bigger and wide-ranging economic consequences, which will go a long way in helping the people of these countries. If you look at it holistically, this appears to be a culmination. Of course, it'll depend on how it shapes up on the ground and how quickly it really takes off. But if you look at it in the context of what has been discussed in so many different forums, if it really comes together, this will be the beginning of a new chapter as far as infrastructure development in these parts of the world are concerned.
All right, Ehtisham, thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue to wait for major details on that. But let's remember, with everything else that's happening about G20, this is almost a positive surprise, a major announcement that we knew was being discussed. But the fact that it was actually announced today at a press conference with Joe Biden there, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi there, Macron was there, Mohammed bin Salman was there, everyone was there. It actually was almost a positive surprise today, almost as much of a surprise as the fact that we actually got a Delhi declaration and we got it so early in the G20. Let's now address one of the elephants in the room. This entire infrastructure project, of course, that was done. Is it possibly an alternative to the BRI? And I'm talking, of course, about China's Belt and Road Initiative. Remember, China, the fact that Xi Jinping was not there, and yet there's been some talk that has China been playing a slightly more constructive role in some of the negotiations around the declaration that was actually expected. What's actually been China's role in all of this? How is China going to view, for example, this infrastructure project? How is China going to view, for example, the fact that Italy, a country that had signed up for the BRI, days after Rome has dropped hints that it is now exiting from the BRI, it now seems to be sitting there very enthusiastically welcoming all of this. Let me throw that question now to Terrell Hugh Jones. He's a senior journalist who spent years reporting on China. China, in many ways, Mr. Jones, is sort of the elephant that is not in the room, quite literally. At the G20, Xi Jinping is not there. His absence is very clear and palpable. And the fact that these sort of announcements are being made, a Delhi declaration being made, the African Union being brought into the G20 with China not being there, and then this big infrastructure push. How do you think all of this is going to be seen in China? Would there be a view in China, for example, that perhaps Xi should have come after all?
Well, of course, we don't know why Xi Jinping is not there. He could be ill, but we don't have any transparency on that. There could be some domestic crisis. We don't have transparency on that either. Or could be simply a strategic move that he wanted to take, perhaps as a snub to India or to the United States or to both. But I do think that she wants to emphasize and build up the Belt and Road Initiative, which has seen some faltering in recent months, that I think he wants to build it into a more regional structure that's kind of an alternative to the G20. In the G20, there are many members aligned against China, aligned with the United States. Whereas in the Belt and Road Initiative, for which the forum next month, China is hosting Belt and Road Forum, Vladimir Putin is scheduled to attend. That I think he wants to build that up into a more powerful alternative in which China has more control and more alliances on its side.
Right. Mr. Jones, the very fact, for example, that in a sense there were some Western concessions that enabled the Delhi Declaration to go through, the West was willing to, for example, make sure that Russia is not being named as an aggressor in the Delhi Declaration, the keenness to put together this alternate infrastructure scheme that we were just talking about. All of this is presumably with an eye to China, right? That the West is really keen to build up other formulations, other structures, build up the G20, make sure that the ties with India are proceeding smoothly so that China can be kept in check.
Yeah, it seems clear that there are already structures in place, such as the G20, but also the APEC and also the quadrilateral security dialogue that in which India is also a member, and that I think China, it seems clear that there is a move to try to I wouldn't say confront, but to not contain either, but to really to face and sort of hold off and face down China through such agreements and organizations as this. China is also a member of BRICS, as is India,
right?
And that with the United States is not there. And I think China is facing off some sensitivities against India in the influence in the BRICS organization, but that bringing in Africa is kind of strategic because China has long had deep relations with Africa, and I think the West, especially the United States, is becoming increasingly concerned over that.
All right, Mr. Jones, thanks for that perspective, and that's a perfect cue in a sense for me to toss to that third major development that I think actually happened today. In many ways, it could also be one of the defining moments of the entire G20 summit. Earlier in the day, when Prime Minister Modi said that there is now consensus, the African Union will be admitted as a permanent member of the G20. Presumably G20 now becomes G21. Now remember, the African Union consists of 55 nations. And this has been a major initiative that Prime Minister Modi has been pushing. He's been writing, he wrote to the G20 leaders, urging them to give full membership to the African Union. The AU has been advocating for permanent membership for 7 years now, so it is potentially something that will be viewed very positively in Africa. For more on that, I'm now being joined by Zemedene Negatu, who's the Global Chairman of Fairfax Africa Fund. He's joining us from Addis Ababa, from Ethiopia. Mr. Negatu, great to have you with us. A big day, I guess, for Africa, a big day for the African Union, getting a seat at the high table, becoming a permanent member at the G20. This must be getting a lot of attention and a lot of enthusiasm there in Africa.
Right. So, as you said, this is a big day for Africa, a big day, I think, for the global South, because Africa has been trying to, has applied for membership for a long time, and it finally came through today. I have to say, 54 countries coming together, being represented by the African Union is the ultimate, I think, testament that Africa is rising and the global community is recognizing the importance, especially when you consider that the world economy as we go forward is going to be very dependent, a lot of the raw materials that comes from Africa on the one hand, but geopolitically, excluding 54 countries for such a long time, I don't think was appropriate. But finally, I'm here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which is the headquarters of the African Union. As you indicated in your intro, it's a big day for Africa, big day for the global South. I think African Union and Africa in general will make a very significant contribution in what is now being considered a priority agenda for rearranging the global order that was set by the West since 1945. So a big day.
So, you know, many here in India are saying that it's actually a moment of some pride for India that this happened under the Indian presidency. Prime Minister Modi got a chance to do it. There was that big bear hug between him and the leader of the African Union as Africa was welcomed out there. There's often been this talk about, you know, India and China vying for influence in Africa. So from that point of view, I guess, from an Indian point of view, this would be a moment particularly to cherish, that the Indian presidency was able to bring Africa onto the high table.
Absolutely. And I think, as you said, Prime Minister Modi should be given a lot of credit. He pushed hard since last year and even before that. So I think he deserves a lot of credit. India deserves a lot of credit. And the fact of the matter is the reason India was heard and was able to deliver not only the African Union thing, but a lot of things that was declared today, even that India, Middle East, Europe thing. I mean, it is credit to Prime Minister Modi. So yes, I absolutely. And also remember, India in the old days was a leader in the non-aligned movement. Now in a different kind of way, of course, the non-aligned movement is not a formal structure, but definitely India continues to lead. And the fact of the matter is that India is now the 5th largest economy in the world, speaks louder than anything else also for India to be heard. When it was a small economy, when it was outside of the top 10. But I think you have to take in context all the things. But the Indian leadership delivered. And as you said, to be honest with you, the G20 normally doesn't get a lot of attention in the media, including yours. But this one was, I mean, it got global attention. And that also is a credit to the Prime Minister.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. Great that you could join us from Ethiopia, from Addis Ababa, on a big day for Africa and a big day for the African Union. Thank you so much for having been with us. So, as I said, it's been a really dramatic day. The Delhi Declaration finally came through. Lots in that. Lots of the developmental agenda was there. Talk about biofuels and biofossils. That's also there. Many bilaterals as well. And then, of course, the other steps that we've been talking about, which have been also happening on the sideline, that infrastructure push linking Europe to the Middle East, onto India, and the entry of the African Union into G20. So a big day. Let's see what happens over dinner, and let's see what happens tomorrow. Thanks a lot for watching. You're watching This World.